There's only two ways things can really come to an end. So, like, I guess you could say it's a spectrum, and that's an end in flames or an end in rot. What do I mean by this? I mean, imagine you have a potato field and you notice the potatoes are sick. You can burn down the entire field and throw away any potential harvest, but you know that any sort of rot that took place is gone. And it's instead fertilized by ash and you can plant potatoes again. Whereas an end in rot is to hope the rot within the field spreads slowly and you keep harvesting the potatoes. Maybe squeezing out 1-2 more harvests before the soil is irreparably corrupted by the fungal spores and nothing really can be planted there anymore for a very, very long time. And I think this basically applies to anything, to how a human life can end, to how a company can collapse, to how a country can collapse, and even to how a world can end. So what would I consider examples of an end in rot? Well, the example of a world would be Dark Souls. Even though it's a theme of flame, every time the flame is lit and extinguished and lit again, there's a little bit of ash that can't be burned again, and we see at the end of the world in the Ringed City when we face Gale in the DLC, that basically all that is left is ash, and there's no hope for a new beginning. Alternatively, you can end the world in flame, so discard what came before, completely destroy it, and start the Age of Darkness, the one that is cold and gentle. So that is ironically the end in flames. Another setting which I would consider to have an end in rot is Warhammer 40k, where obviously humanity is besieged from all sides, slowly being destroyed, slowly eaten away, and it has been so long that there is really no hope of it being recovered, except plot contrivances, which did happen. So I guess this is actually one of the reasons why one might prefer to enter a state of rot rather than burn things down in flames. But I should first probably get done with examples. An example from the real life what would be an end in rot, it's how the companies function. A company becomes so integral to the functioning of a country, it's not allowed to go bankrupt anymore. So every time it's close to going bankrupt, the state bails them out, which introduces more inefficiencies, which makes the country weaker, which makes other competitors less able to compete, because that one company is basically a partner of the state. And because it's not allowed to go bankrupt, it's continuously rotting, continuously becoming less efficient. Whereas if it bankrupted and collapsed and its assets had to be sold, you would get a possibly awful collapse. Depending on the type of company it is, people could be starving to death. But in its place, multiple other companies would rise, which would then compete with one another and probably be much more efficient. And lastly, a personal example. Well, you could say that dying of old age is an end in rot, whereas going out bombastically, like in cyberpunk settings, that would be an end in flames. So that's much harder to say because unlike countries and states, such an end is actually permanent. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? As said with the potato field example. If you just burn down the field, you can very quickly replant the seeds. But it's a very hard choice to make because can you survive the winter without any potatoes? I mean, it's very easy to say, just power through, but if you burn down the potato field, you won't have money, you won't have food, you won't have anything until the potatoes regrow, which, who knows, maybe it will not be enough to wait a year, maybe it will have to be 2. The disadvantage of letting the field rot is obviously that you might buy yourself time, but once the field is completely destroyed, then there's no real way to recover it. On the other hand though, with the time you bought yourself, maybe you can find another solution to fix the field. Maybe you get lucky, maybe you can buy another field. Which I would often call a plot if it happens in fiction, like in 140k with the return of Gilman and Belisarius Call. I would call that a very bad plot contrivance, but it is something that happened historically. A very good example of that is Rome, where it would just start collapsing and then one great general or emperor came back and just brought it all back. Where arguably one would say, okay, Rome is failing, we need to let it collapse and get functional states in place. No, it was fixed again and again and again and again, until it eventually collapsed properly. I would say we are, like, as a human civilization in a way, in an age of rot, very much so, because there is a few very big companies which own more companies, and the net is so connected with the economy and how the stock market works that none of them are really able or possible to ever go bankrupt. If there is ever a danger of it going bankrupt, the state will bail them out, which is a pipeline of money from the poor to the rich, and those companies are horribly inefficient. I think we have all seen these TikTok videos where people are paid to essentially do nothing, and they're paid disgusting wages to do nothing, and every time that happens, money is funneled from the poorest, or like the middle class, to the richest. And that's basically the possibility of an ending rot, because there is no possibility of a Great Depression like collapse where all the great companies which you have now fall apart, because that possibility basically does not exist. It means that the rot will continue to fester. It's same politically. Every single country that exists, every government continuously passes laws so that there is more laws. A big reason for that is because we have permanent parliament and permanent politicians in positions of power. So their job is to pass laws, so they sit there and they just pass laws. Arguably, the only solution to that system would be to have a completely separate parliament whose only role is to remove laws, to keep it somewhat balanced. But this basically means that unless the government completely collapses, like let's say in a revolution, the amount of laws and as such the amount of freedom that people have both will keep decreasing. But again, this is now the question of the fire or rot. We live in an age of rot, and in a way things will only keep getting worse and worse and worse. But they will keep getting worse slowly. That's the temptation of it all, isn't it? Like, things will be worse next year, things will be significantly worse in 10 years. But if we try to like completely fix the system, if it's even possible, it would need to be through an induced collapse through the economy, an induced collapse of states. Not just one state, basically all states, or at least the United States, considering it's in many ways a world hegemon. And who would want to live through that? Who would want to live through World War III and the Great Depression combined? That doesn't sound nice, does it? Even if after that you could expect actually the world to recover, like what happened after World War II and World War One, or less World War One, but more World War II. We have made the greatest leaps in technology since forever. We have had the greatest period of prosperity, I would say, between 1950 and 1980 as a world, not as a singular country. But then the rot started to fester. My hypothesis is that things will continuously get worse unless there's a world war, unless there's a Great Depression. But of course I would not want to live through events like that. It would not be nice. But whenever one proposes a hypothesis or like a solution, one needs to ask themselves, okay, what if I'm wrong? What if there is some sort of hypothetical way out where the world can return to its glory and economical and political prosperity it somewhat had previously, or at least of a state of hope for a better future? In that case, of course, a World War III or an economic collapse would be a travesty. And this is again an allure of rot, which is why I kind of think Nurgle is a really nice chaos god, thematically, because he's linked to hope and he's linked to like disease and corruption, stuff like that. Because one of the reasons to never put out a failing system or a dying person out of their misery is hope. Hope that things get better. But the longer you hope things get better, the worse they get, don't they? All solutions need to be considered temporary. So even if an end in fire is to reach, so all the political systems are destroyed, things are destroyed, the new companies rise. Over time, it has to be understood that over time, over 50, 60 years, we will get the same problem again and over again. And that's a universal rule, I'd say. Every time a system exists for a prolonged period of time, it becomes bloated from continuously new laws being passed and from people learning how to exploit them. And then another fire will need to happen. With rot though, who knows how long a rot can persist in a somewhat stable state. An example for that would be China. There have been times where China has been stable for very, very long times, even though people lived in relative poverty to the rest of the world, like the Qing dynasty. Well, the Qing stayed stable for something like 200 years. The West went through an industrial revolution, through plagues, through wars, stuff like that. But the Qing just kinda hang in there. And they did eventually collapse. What's preferable, to live in a stable but poor society and oppressed society, or to accept the fact that from time to time we need to have this violent revolution or this violent upheaval in hopes the society reforms and is better again. And as with the Qing shown again, even if the rot just keeps settling in, at some point the flames come in knocking again anyway. And that's also the other question with the Age of Flames. Maybe sometimes the flames can be so ravaging that no potatoes can grow afterwards anyway, the soil just dries out, for example. Let's be honest here, if a World War III started, nuclear weapons would fly. We of course don't have anywhere near enough nuclear weapons to destroy modern civilization completely, but we have a lot. And we could probably rapidly produce new ones if a need existed to rapidly produce more. So it might very well be that if we try to do a reset or do a restructurization of the world order, there's nothing coming after that. So what would be the solution in this case? Yeah, again, no clue really. I guess unless you want to start World War III or a new economic collapse, which is impossible because of bailouts again, the only way is to really keep things from rotting as quickly as they do, and just slow down how quickly things go to shit. Yeah, just like in Warhammer 40k, before, when it was still good. There is no way to defeat the Tyranids, you can just slow them down. And who knows, maybe that's enough. Enough for at least a lifetime or two.